Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 48. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode. Steve, tell me who you are.
I'm Steve Parky and I'm from the Potterspury History Group.
Now, you've been on a quest, and the quest has rendered you the object which is now in the exhibition. Describe the item to me, if you would.
Well, it's a jug. It's 300 millimetres, a footish in height. It looks very similar to other medieval pottery. It's got a handle which has been slightly broken, but it comes from Potterspury, where I'm from. The whole point of the object was to point out that we have this place called Potterspury, and pottery is in its name, and that in the past, the pottery from it, because of what happened in about 1718 or thereabouts, when somebody wrote a description of Potterspury in a history book on the natural history of Northamptonshire, sort of said it was brittle and not very particularly good. And I thought, well, hang on a second, 400 years of production of pottery in Potterspury, then it must be reasonably good. Can I get hold of a copy to show in the exhibition? When I started, the people in Northampton, they had a broken pot which had been glued together, which came from Potterspury. And I thought, well, that's not a particularly attractive example that the public would actually think was worth coming to look at. They'd look at it and think, well, it's just a piece of broken pottery. I wanted something that actually represented what they actually produced in the village.
You've made the connection between pottery and Potterspury. Does Potterspury take its name from pottery making?
Absolutely, yes, definitely. And it goes back to 1287 or thereabouts as the first record of the place being called not just Perry, and it would be called East Perry to define the fact that it was different from East Perry, which is now Potterspury. Somebody said, well, it's called Potterspury because that's where they make pottery. And it stuck, they produced pottery for 4 centuries, and it's stuck ever since. So that's one of the reasons. The short version is pottery is in our name.
I like the line. Was Potterspury effectively exporting pottery to the wider world?
It was exporting it as far as other counties is concerned. They found examples in Oxfordshire, in Buckinghamshire, in Bedfordshire, it had a range of about 20 miles over which it was distributed. So people would buy it locally, I expect, and take it home. It was jugs. A lot of it was jugs.
And the work itself, was it made on an industrial basis in a factory, or was it done as piecework in people's homes?
It was effectively like piecework in people's homes. There were small kilns. Obviously, there were specialist potters in the village, and they would have a kiln on a bit of waste ground near their house. And the kilns would be probably about 2 metres in diameter, 2 metres in height. They would be loaded up. They'd be fired by wood. And it was really cottage industry rather than industrialisation. And that was the problem, because I think that's what effectively happened is when industrialisation came along, pottery like that made locally became less useful because it was more brittle, more fragile, more difficult.
Now, at the start of our conversation, you said that there had been criticism of Potterspury clay and Potterspury product as not being very good, and you were looking for something that was very good. How difficult was it to find this particular object?
If you look online, you can find examples of Potterspury ware in for example, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Getting it from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, it was somewhat difficult. And there are examples in other places, but they're all fractured, they're all fragments. Because one of the problems is that if you come from a place where pottery is made, what you usually find nearby are the broken remains of things that didn't work out. And these sherds are what the archaeologists, to reconstruct things from, but you don't find complete items very often.
So do you know the history of this particular object?
I do, to a certain extent. I don't know who made it. We know where the kiln is. It was in Church End in Potterspury, because that's where it was found. And it was found when somebody decided to build a house on the site of an old barn and they produced and they suddenly found, when they were digging the foundations, that they had a pottery kiln in the foundations. At that point, they didn't really tell anybody particularly that they'd found it, and so they did the archaeology themselves. And Mrs. Ladd, who lived there and was having the house built in the 70s, did a lot of really good archaeology on her own in the trench there that they found by the kiln. And she found lots and lots of broken pottery and kept it for years. And she had it professionally examined and photographed and catalogued. But she didn't actually find this particular jug. What happened was their builder found a complete jug when he was building the house, and unbeknown to Mrs. Ladd, he basically took it off-site and kept it for 40 years. After 40 years, he suddenly thought, well, maybe I ought to return it to what you might call the rightful owners, Mr. and Mrs. Ladd. And so he returned it to Mrs. Ladd and said, here's your pot back. I knew that Mrs. Ladd had lots of broken pottery, but that was way before this exhibition had been planned, and unfortunately she had died. And so I set about looking for what happened and found that her son lived in Northampton, got in touch with him, and he said, oh yes, I've got all this catalogue stuff, and oh, by the way, I've got this big jug. And so we met for the very first time a few weeks ago and basically put it into the exhibition.
The object people can come and see for themselves. What do you feel that it says about Northamptonshire?
Well, it says that there was a local rural production in Northamptonshire producing this sort of ware. I think, you think about shoes and other production, you think about lace. But I think people have this idea that nearly all pottery comes from the potteries, and it all came in the Industrial Revolution. Before that, there was pottery locally produced on the scale that Potterspury produced and radiated around. Transport was difficult. The canals hadn't come. It wasn't industrialised, a large process. It was a cottage industry. In some of the history, there is a suggestion that the canals were the source of the demise of pottery. I think it died out before that. It was the industrialisation rather than the communications that did it.
So Pottersbury pottery, it has its own reputation. Does it have its own character?
I believe it does. It can be identified by experts. I couldn't identify it. I'm not a pottery expert. I'm just an enthusiast. But I can see that it has a sort of localish character because the clay is the clay from nearby. Experts can look at it and say, well, that is Pottersbury ware. And that's what happened with this one, because having received this jug, you just wonder, well, did it come from some other place and just happened to be found there? But it didn't. They have determined that it is Pottersbury ware, and it is mid-medieval, basically.
What's your feeling about the piece as a piece? You went on a quest to go and find it. Yeah. You found it. Yeah. How do you feel about it?
Well, I feel it's a really amazing piece for another reason. I mean, it's not beautiful. It's not, it's not fantastic. It's fairly mundane. But think of its survival. So it was made, and its handle was probably broken just after it was made. And that's probably the reason why the potter just discarded it, and he may have just put it locally. But then, after the pottery closed, maybe 1600 or thereabouts, they took the site and they built a stone barn over it. And this stone barn was significant. It was a big building, and it was where the Duke of Grafton kept his horses and carriages when he went to visit St Nicholas Church every Sunday. So it had a lot of traffic, this barn. And then eventually the barn got demolished in the 1970s and the house built, and it was found. And you just think, well, that's a particularly good story. And I've recently found that even one time an incendiary bomb landed nearby as well, which is another point of danger that it had. So it had an amazingly good survival. It had a precarious story, really.
It sounds as though it might have had quite a number of lives, and it might have been purloined by a builder, but clearly he's looked after it because it now exists and survives to this day.
Yeah, I think purloined might be a strong word, but it was, yes, he kept it. But as Mr. Ladd said to me, we are all custodians. He became a let's say, unofficial custodian of the jug.
Steve, you represent the Pottersbury History Group. Does anybody make pottery at all in Pottersbury any longer? And if not, should they?
That's a good question. Nobody does, and maybe they should.
Well, it's a fascinating look back on the past for something that has stood the test of time and perhaps efforts that otherwise would have broken asunder previous items. It's lovely to have it in the exhibition, telling the story as it does of part of Northamptonshire and, I suppose, to the waiting world, the wider relevance of pottery made in Northamptonshire. Good on you for taking up the quest and for finding the item itself and bringing it to the exhibition. Thanks for telling me about it here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.